This bag is gorgeous. I'm taking it for my mother." My daughter-in-law held up the Hermes Birkin I worked 2 years of overtime to buy my wife for our 10th anniversary. My son stood right there and said nothing. I told her calmly to put it down. What I got back were words I will not repeat here. They thought they had everything under control. They thought they had already won. They were wrong. They had no idea what was coming for them after that day. Before we go further, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. You would be surprised how far these wise revenge stories travel. And if no one has told you lately that standing your ground matters, I am about to. This story contains fictional elements crafted for educational purposes. Names and locations are coincidental. The wisdom, however, is not. I have been a mechanic for 31 years. I know what it sounds like when something is about to break, not the loud crack of metal giving way, but the quieter sound that comes before it. A faint vibration where there should be none. A rhythm that shifts by half a beat. Most people never hear it. They keep driving until the engine seizes on the freeway, and they are standing on the shoulder wondering how they never saw it coming. I heard that sound the afternoon Julian and Vanessa pulled into my driveway. I was standing at the entrance to my garage when their car turned off Vanawan Street and came up the block. A silver Honda Accord with a cracked side mirror that Julian had been meaning to fix for 2 years. I knew the car the same way I knew the sound of my son's footsteps. Some things you carry in your body without deciding to. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and watched them park. Evelyn came out the front door before I could move. She had been watching from the kitchen window. She always knew when Julian was close, the way mothers do by some frequency the rest of us cannot pick up on. She walked down the porch steps with her arms already open, and Julian got out of the car and hugged her the way he used to when he was 12 years old and had a bad day at school, holding on a half-second longer than necessary. I noticed that. Vanessa stepped out from the passenger side. She was dressed nicely for a weekday afternoon, pressed slacks, a camel-colored blazer that cost more than our monthly electric bill. She gave Evelyn a hug that was correct in every technical detail and looked over Evelyn's shoulder at our house while she did it. Not the way you look at a place you are grateful to be welcomed into. The way you look at a place you are trying to understand. She moved her eyes from the roofline to the front windows, to the side gate leading to the backyard, slow and methodical, taking measurements I had not given her permission to take. Harrison. She turned to me with a smile that arrived fully formed, like she had been holding it ready. "Thank you so much for having us. I know this is an adjustment." "Come on in," I said. That was all I said. Dennis Clark was trimming the hedge along his side of the property line. He had lived next door for 15 years, a retired electrician from Ohio, steady and quiet, more valley than most people who grew up here. He lifted his clippers when he saw Julian. "Hey, Jules, long time." He looked at the boxes in the back seat of the Accord. 4 of them, plus 2 duffel bags. "Moving back in." Julian laughed, and it was almost the right kind of laugh. "Just for a little while. Saving up, you know how it is." "Sure," Dennis said. He looked at me over Julian's shoulder. I gave him nothing because I had nothing to give yet. He went back to his hedge. We carried the boxes inside. Julian talked while he worked, filling the air with plans they were going to save aggressively. They had a number in mind, 18 months, maybe 2 years at the outside, and then they would have enough for a down payment on something in the valley, maybe Northridge or Chatsworth somewhere, with a yard eventually. He said it all with the energy of someone who has rehearsed it enough times that it moves through the mouth easily without friction. I listened and carried a box and said nothing, because a man who has rebuilt enough engines knows that a clean, smooth sound is not always a sign of health. Sometimes it is a sign of compression building somewhere you cannot see. Vanessa walked through the house ahead of us. She moved from room to room while Julian and I brought in the boxes, and I watched her from the corner of my eye, the way I watch a new customer in the shop, quietly, without making it obvious I am watching. She stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the layout. She paused at the window in the dining room that faces the backyard, and the old orange tree Evelyn has been cultivating for 11 years. She ran her hand along the hallway wall near the linen closet, then opened the closet door and looked inside, then closed it again. She opened the storage cabinet in the living room, the one I built myself from Douglas fir in 2009, and looked at the shelves without being asked. "Good storage space," she said. Evelyn beamed. "Harrison built those himself. Took him an entire weekend." Vanessa turned and looked at me with that ready smile. "Really? Impressive." I thanked her and went to get another box from the car. Evelyn made pot roast for dinner. She had been planning it since Julian called Tuesday to confirm the move-in date. She bought the chuck roast from the butcher on Reseda Boulevard, the one she has used since 1998, not the supermarket. She set the table with the good plates. She lit the candles she saves for birthdays. My chest felt tight watching her do it, though I could not have told you exactly why at that moment. Dinner was the four of us around the table that has seated this family for 28 years. Julian told a story about a co-worker that made Evelyn laugh hard enough to reach for her napkin. I watched Vanessa during the story. Her fork moved from plate to mouth at regular intervals. Her eyes moved to her phone twice. And once, just once, when Julian was distracted by Evelyn's laughter, Vanessa raised her phone above the table and took a photograph of the living room through the dining room doorway. Not a photo of the family, a photo of the room. Wide angle. Deliberate. She put the phone face down on the table before Julian turned back. I finished my pot roast. I told Evelyn it was the best she had made in years, which was true. I cleared my plate and said I was going to check on something in the garage, which was also true. Though what I needed to check had nothing to do with any car. In the garage, I opened the Nest app on my phone. The security system covers the kitchen, the living room, the hallway, and both exterior doors. I installed it 2 years ago after a string of garage break-ins on the street. 4 cameras total. Motion-activated cloud storage, 60 days of rolling footage. I had checked it maybe a dozen times since installation, mostly when the app sent an alert, mostly nothing important. I scrolled back through the afternoon's footage. Kitchen camera, 4:47 p.m. The dining room camera, timestamp 4:52 p.m. Living room camera. And there was Vanessa standing in front of the storage cabinet, running her hand along the edge of the built-in shelves. She stood there for 11 seconds. Then she took 2 steps toward the center of the room, turned slowly, and looked at the ceiling. At the ceiling. The way a contractor looks at a ceiling when he is thinking about load-bearing walls. I locked the phone screen and set it face down on my workbench. Outside, through the gap under the garage door, I could hear Evelyn's voice from the kitchen. She was washing dishes and singing something low and tuneless, the way she does when she is happy. The way she has done since I have known her. I stood in the garage for a while longer than I needed to. Saturday came in slow the way weekends do in the valley, when the Santa Ana winds have died down and the air sits heavy and warm over everything. I was in the garage running a compression test on a neighbor's Tacoma when I heard Evelyn call my name. Not the way she calls when lunch is ready. Not the way she calls when she needs a jar opened. The way she calls when something has already gone wrong and she needs me to come stand next to her while she figures out how wrong it is. I set down the gauge and walked inside. Evelyn was in the hallway outside our bedroom door. She was holding herself the way small animals hold themselves when something larger is nearby, arms crossed at the chest, shoulders pulled in. Vanessa stood in the middle of our bedroom with the closet door open and our Hermes Birkin bag dangling from 2 fingers, like it was something she had picked up off a clearance rack. "This bag is gorgeous," Vanessa said. She turned it side to side, examining the stitching. "Mom would absolutely love this. I'm going to bring it to her next time we visit." Evelyn stepped forward, and her voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "That was a gift. Harrison gave it to me for our 10th anniversary. It is very special to me, sweetheart." "Mom, it's a bag." Julian appeared from behind me in the hallway. He had his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular way he uses when he has already decided what he thinks before hearing both sides. "You have 2 closets full of stuff you never use. Vanessa's mom doesn't have nice things. What's the big deal?" "Julian." Evelyn's voice cracked on the second syllable of his name. 1 word, 2 syllables. 30 years of loving him and not understanding what she was hearing. I stepped past her into the doorway. "Put it down," I said. Vanessa looked at me. She was not embarrassed. She was not startled. She tilted her chin up slightly the way people do when they have decided the other person does not have the standing to give them instructions. For 3 full seconds, she held my eyes with that calculation sitting openly in hers. Then she set the bag on the bed. Not gently. She dropped it onto the comforter from 8 inches up, and the leather made a sound against the fabric that I felt in my back teeth. "Fine," she said. "I'm getting my nails done." She picked it up her own purse from the nightstand. She had already put it there, which meant she had planned to be in this room, and walked past me through the doorway without touching me and without looking at Evelyn. Julian stood in the hallway a moment longer. He opened his mouth, closed it, and followed his wife out. I listened to the front door close, then the car doors, then the engine turning over and the Accord pulling out. Evelyn walked to the bed and picked up the Birkin with both hands and held it against her chest. She did not cry. She pressed her lips together and looked out the window at nothing in particular while she held the bag the way you hold something you are reminding yourself still belongs to you. I thought about the bag, not the leather or the brand name. I could not have cared less about either. I thought about the 2 years I worked Saturday overtime at Kowalski's shop to save for it. I thought about the morning I set the box on the kitchen table, and Evelyn opened it and looked up at me with her eyes already gone bright and said, "Harrison, you absolutely did not." I thought about her wearing it to her sister's wedding in Pasadena in 2012, how she carried it on her arm all evening like it was the most natural thing in the world, like she had always had beautiful things and always would. "Go sit in the garden for a while," I told her. "I'll bring you some iced tea." She nodded and went. I brought her the tea. I watched her settle into the patio chair under the orange tree. Then I went back inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I had screenshots from the Nest app already, the footage of Vanessa examining the living room ceiling Friday afternoon. I added a new folder. Then I opened Facebook Marketplace on a browser, typed Hermes Birkin Los Angeles into the search bar, and found it in under 40 seconds. The photographs were taken in our hallway. The light fixtures gave it away. I installed those fixtures myself in 2017, a specific brushed nickel finish that Evelyn had picked out from a catalog. 3 photos, different angles, professional composition. The listing read, Hermes Birkin, limited edition, excellent condition, no box, serious buyers only. Price $4,000. Posted at 4:47 in the afternoon. While Vanessa was supposedly still at the nail salon, I sat with that for a moment. $4,000 was not nothing. But that was not what made my jaw tighten. What made my jaw tighten was the photographs taken in my hallway. What made my jaw tighten was the understanding that she had planned this before she picked up the bag. She had known what she was going to do before she opened our closet door. The outrage was not impulsive. It was a step in something larger that I could not yet see the full shape of. I took a screenshot of the listing. I saved it to the new folder. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to Evelyn humming something out in the garden, that low, tuneless sound she makes when she is trying to find her way back to herself after something has shaken her. I opened the Nest app. I navigated to the footage archive and started at the beginning, the day Julian and Vanessa moved in. I was not sure what I was looking for. I only knew there was more to find, and I had learned a long time ago at the shop that when you know a problem exists, you do not stop looking just because you have found one symptom. You keep looking until you find the source. I did not sleep well. I lay in the dark next to Evelyn and listened to the house breathe the tick of the water heater in the hallway, the low hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car passing on Vanawan with its headlights sweeping across the ceiling. Evelyn slept with her hand resting near the edge of the bed, fingers slightly open the way she always has. I watched her for a while. Then I stared at the ceiling for a while longer. At 5:30, I gave up and got up. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table and watched the sky outside the window go from black to the particular gray-purple that comes just before the San Fernando Valley decides to be morning. I had my phone on the table next to my mug. I had looked at the Nest footage until past midnight and found nothing new beyond what I had already screenshotted. But I had the feeling of a man who has diagnosed one problem correctly and knows there are others he has not found yet. That feeling does not let you sleep. I have learned not to fight it. At 5:58, I heard a sound from the hallway. Not Evelyn. I know every variation of my wife's footsteps, the unhurried shuffle when she is heading to the kitchen for water, the deliberate heel to toe when she is trying not to wake me. This was lighter, more careful. The sound of someone who wanted to cover ground without being recorded by it. I set my mug down without making noise and stood up. The hallway was dim. The nightlight near the bathroom threw just enough light to see by. Vanessa was at our bedroom door with her right hand on the door handle turned halfway, body angled through the gap. She had not opened it all the way. She was listening first. "Looking for something," I said. She spun around fast. Her shoulder hit the doorframe and the door swung open behind her. She recovered quickly, I will give her that. Inside of 2 seconds, she had straightened up and arranged her face into something that was supposed to look like calm. "I was just checking on Evelyn," she said. "I thought I heard something." "At 6 in the morning. I'm an early riser." I looked at her. I looked at our bedroom door standing open behind her. "Evelyn is sleeping," I said. "Go back to your room, Vanessa." The calm face cracked around the edges. Her chin came up. "You know what, Harrison, this whole thing is ridiculous. It's a handbag. You people are treating it like it's the crown jewels. Evelyn has so much stuff in that closet she hasn't touched in years, and my mother has nothing, and you're standing here acting like I committed a crime. You listed it for sale yesterday afternoon," I said. "On Facebook Marketplace, $4,000. Photos taken in my hallway." Her mouth opened. For the first time since she had arrived in my house, something moved behind her eyes that was not calculation. It was closer to the look of someone who has just stepped on a board they expected to hold and felt it give. Before she could answer, Julian came out of the guest room. He was in a t-shirt and sweatpants, hair pushed up on one side from the pillow, moving fast the way people move when they wake up to the sound of their own name being spoken in a tone they recognize as dangerous. He took in the hallway, me, Vanessa, the open bedroom door, and he made his decision in under a second. He stepped between us and turned to face me with his shoulders squared. "Dad, back off. You're making this into something it isn't." "I haven't raised my voice," I said. "You don't have to raise your voice. I know how you get." He exhaled hard through his nose. Vanessa was trying to do something nice for her mother. That's it. Can we just let it go? I looked at my son. I looked at the lines around his eyes that had not been there 5 years ago, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides without him seeming to notice. I thought about the listing on Facebook Marketplace. I thought about the footage of Vanessa measuring our living room with her eyes. I thought about a lot of things very quickly. Then I asked him one question. How much do you owe Julian? The hallway went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Julian's shoulders dropped a fraction. His fists opened. He looked at me and then looked away at the wall to my left at some point in the middle distance that had nothing on it he actually wanted to see. That's not what this is about, he said. His voice had lost its heat. How much? Vanessa put her hand on Julian's arm. Julian, we don't have to. How much, Julian? I was not angry. I was not loud. I was asking the way I ask when I already know the answer is in the room, and I am simply waiting for someone to stop pretending otherwise. He ran a hand through his hair. His jaw worked. He looked at me once more, and in that look I saw something I had not seen on my son's face since he was 17 years old and had broken something he could not fix, the expression of a person who has been carrying a weight they told everyone wasn't there. We're behind, he said finally. Okay, we're behind on some things. It's being handled. Evelyn appeared in the bedroom doorway then. She had woken up. She stood with one hand on the doorframe in her robe, hair down, looking at the three of us in the hallway, with the particular stillness of a woman who has understood more than anyone told her. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Vanessa turned and went back to the guest room. Julian followed her. The guest room door closed. Evelyn looked at me across the hallway, and I looked back at her, and neither of us needed to say what we were both thinking. I went to the kitchen and poured my cold coffee down the drain and made a fresh pot. That evening, I stayed in the garage until 9 o'clock, organizing tools that did not need organizing. When I finally came inside, the house was quiet and most of the lights were off. But the kitchen light was on. Julian was sitting at the table alone with a bottle of Jim Beam in front of him and a glass that had been refilled more than once. He looked up when I walked in. He did not tell me to leave. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. I did not turn on the kitchen light. Julian had not turned it on either. The only light came from the range hood above the stove, that low amber glow Evelyn leaves on at night, so the kitchen is never completely dark. It threw long shadows across the table and made everything look older than it was. Julian poured 2 fingers into his glass and did not offer me any. I did not ask. I folded my hands on the table and waited. That is the thing about silence between a father and a son. It is never neutral. It has weight and texture and history. The silence between Julian and me that night had 30 years in it, every conversation we had finished and everyone we had avoided. I had learned a long time ago that if I waited long enough, Julian would fill it. He always had since he was 8 years old and had broken something and could not stand the not telling more than the consequence. He lasted 11 minutes. I counted. We lost everything, Dad. He said it to the glass, not to me. His voice was flat in the way voices get when a person has been carrying something so long that saying it out loud does not feel like relief anymore. It just feels like putting it down. Not some of it. All of it. I kept my hands folded. Tell me. He told me. It came out in pieces, not in order the way a true accounting always does when someone has been rearranging it in their head for too long. Cryptocurrency, he had put $60,000 into a leveraged position 18 months ago, borrowing against the investment to amplify potential returns. When the market dropped 40% in 6 weeks, the brokerage issued a margin call, meaning they demanded immediate repayment of the borrowed amount, or they would liquidate his holdings at a loss. He could not cover it. He lost the position and the borrowed funds both. Then a real estate investment fund, he and Vanessa had pooled $40,000 into a private fund, promising 12% annual returns, the kind of vehicle that sounds legitimate, until the operator stops answering emails. The fund collapsed. Their money was gone. The remainder was a hard money loan. A short-term, high-interest private loan outside the traditional banking system. The kind people take when their credit cannot get them a conventional loan, and they are desperate enough not to read the fine print carefully. The interest rate was 18% annually. They had borrowed $40,000 to cover living expenses while they tried to recover from the first 2 losses. The loan was now in default, total just over $180,000. He said the number and then picked up his glass and drank from it and set it down again. His hand was not steady. "We couldn't make rent," he said. "We had 2 months left in the account when we called you about moving in. I told Vanessa we had to tell you the truth." He stopped. His thumbnail worked at a groove in the wood of the table. "She said we didn't have to tell you everything right away, that we should just get settled first." "And the bag," I said. His thumbnail stopped moving. "Julian." My voice was quiet, not angry. Anger was not what I felt. What I felt was the particular grief of a parent who has watched a child make a mistake so large that understanding it fully takes more than one sitting. "The bag." He exhaled through his nose, long and unsteady like something deflating. "I knew she was going to try to sell it. I didn't know she'd already listed it, but I knew she was thinking about it and I didn't stop her." He finally looked up at me. His eyes were red at the rims, not from crying from the whiskey and the not sleeping and the weight of what he had been holding since before they ever packed those boxes. I told myself it was just a bag. I told myself Mom would understand if she knew how bad things were. I told myself a lot of things. "You told yourself a story," I said. He looked back down. "Yeah." The range hood hummed above us. Outside, a dog barked twice on the next block and went quiet. I thought about Evelyn holding that bag against her chest yesterday afternoon, pressing it to her like something she needed to confirm was still there. I thought about the 2 years of Saturday overtime it had taken me to buy it, and I thought about how none of that was the point anymore. Julian stood up too fast and his chair scraped back. He steadied himself with one hand on the table. His jacket was hanging on the back of the chair, and when he grabbed it to push it aside, the jacket fell to the floor. A handful of papers fell with it, envelopes, folded documents, the kind of mail that arrives in windows, envelopes with urgent printed in red on the outside. He did not pick them up. I leaned over and picked them up myself. 3 envelopes from 2 different banks. 1 letter from a private lending company called Summit Bridge Capital, the hard money lender. The word "final notice" was printed across the top of that one in heavy black type. I looked at them. I set them on the table between us. Julian looked at them on the table and then looked away. He did not reach for them. He was done pretending they did not exist, but he was not ready to touch them either. "I go to bed," I said. "Dad." "Get some sleep. We'll talk when you're sober." He picked up his jacket from the floor. He stood there a moment with it in his hand, looking at me with his face doing things he did not have enough control left to hide. Then he nodded once and walked out. I sat at the table alone. I picked up the letters and read each one carefully all the way through. Then I stacked them neatly and set them beside my phone. In the morning, I would call Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb's office was on Olive Avenue in Burbank, on the second floor of a building that had been a savings and loan before the 2008 crash, and had been various other things since. The elevator was slow and smelled like old coffee. The waiting area had 3 chairs and a plant that had been alive for so long it had become furniture. His assistant, a woman named Greta, who had worked for Marcus since before I knew him, looked up when I walked in and said, "He's expecting you," without asking my name. Marcus and I had met in 1987 at Kowalski's shop, when he was a weekend mechanic working his way through Loyola Law School, and I was a full-time employee who thought law school was for people who could not fix things with their hands. We had argued about that exact point for about 6 months before we became friends. He had been a careful, precise man at 24, and 37 years had not changed that. What 37 years had changed was the quality of his suits and the depth of the lines around his eyes. He stood up when I came in, which he always does, and poured coffee without asking, which he also always does. He set the mug in front of me and sat down and looked at me across the desk, the way he looks when he already knows the conversation is going to require him to say something I do not want to hear. "Talk to me," he said. I talked. I laid it out in order: the move-in, the bag, the Facebook marketplace listing the footage of Vanessa examining the living room ceiling, Julian's confession the night before the debt letters. I put the stack of letters on his desk. He read each one without rushing, then set them in a neat pile to the side. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question I had not expected. "Has anything in the house been behaving strangely? Appliances, utilities, things that could be attributed to Evelyn being careless or confused?" My coffee mug stopped halfway to my mouth. I set it down. I told him about the kitchen stove, the smell on a Tuesday afternoon when Evelyn said she had not used it. The bathroom faucet that had overflowed one morning, which Evelyn had apologized for, and I had not thought about again until this moment. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Or someone wanted those things to happen, and wanted Evelyn in the vicinity when they did. "Explain that to me." He folded his hands on the desk. "In California, if a person wants to take legal control of another person's finances and property, one avenue is conservatorship. Under California Probate Code sections 1800 and following, a court can appoint a conservator, essentially a legal guardian for adults, if the person is demonstrated to lack the capacity to manage their own financial affairs or personal care. The conservator then has legal authority to make decisions about assets, including real property, meaning the house. But here is the key: the burden of proof is on the petitioner. They need evidence. Medical evaluations, documented incidents of confusion or dangerous behavior, a pattern they can show a judge. He paused. A video of an elderly woman leaving the gas on. A video of her flooding the bathroom. Several incidents documented over several weeks. That is the kind of evidence a petition is built on. The coffee in my mug had gone cold without my noticing. If someone were deliberately staging those incidents, Marcus continued, and recording them and building a file with the intention of filing a conservatorship petition that moves out of civil law into criminal territory. California Penal Code, Section 368, covers elder abuse. The statute includes financial abuse, physical abuse, and what the law calls neglect and endangerment. Deliberately staging dangerous situations to manufacture evidence against an elderly person with the intent to gain control of their assets, that is criminal elder abuse. A felony, Harrison. Not a civil dispute. A felony. I sat with that word for a moment. Felony. I had spent 31 years fixing things that were broken. I had never once in my life sat across a desk from an attorney and heard that word applied to something happening in my own home. "Do you have a security camera system?" Marcus asked. "Nest. 4 cameras covering all common areas. I installed it 2 years ago. Motion-activated cloud storage, 60 days of rolling footage." Marcus looked at me steadily. "Go home and watch all of it. From the day they moved in." He picked up a pen and turned it between his fingers. The thing he does when he is thinking faster than he is speaking. "Whatever you find, do not confront anyone. Do not delete anything. Do not move the cameras. Call me first. And if I find what I think I'm going to find, then we talk about next steps. But Harrison." He set the pen down. "If this is what it looks like, they have been planning this for longer than you know. Which means you need to be more patient than you want to be. Let them build their case. Because the further they go, the more clearly criminal their intent becomes." He looked at me over the rim of his own mug. "You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand." "Good." He stood, which meant the meeting was over. "Call me the moment you find something on that footage, day or night." I drove home on the 170 South, with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The valley spread out around me in every direction, flat and enormous and bright under the Monday afternoon sun. I thought about Evelyn at home right now, probably in her garden talking to her plants, the way she does, completely unaware that someone in her own house had been building a legal case against her one staged incident at a time. I pulled into the driveway. I did not go inside. I went straight to the garage, sat down in front of my laptop, and opened the Nest app. The footage archive went back 60 days. I started at the beginning. The garage smelled like motor oil and old cardboard the way it always has. I had worked in worse conditions for better reasons. I pulled my shop stool up to the workbench, opened the Nest app on my laptop, and navigated to the footage archive. 60 days of rolling storage. 4 cameras. I started from the day Julian and Vanessa moved in and worked forward, fast-forwarding through the long stretches of nothing, Evelyn in the garden, the empty hallway in the afternoon, the kitchen between meals. I was not sure what I was looking for beyond what Marcus had suggested. I only knew I would recognize it when I saw it. I found the first one on day 3, kitchen camera. The timestamp read 2:14 in the afternoon. Evelyn came into frame from the hallway, put on her gardening gloves at the counter, and went out the back door. The door closed behind her. For 17 seconds, the kitchen was empty. Then Vanessa walked in. She came from the hallway, not from the guest room. She had been somewhere in the middle of the house, waiting. She moved to the stove and looked over her shoulder once at the back door. Then she reached out and turned the front left burner knob to the medium position. Not to ignite, the Nest camera picks up the click of ignition, and there was none. She turned the knob to medium, which opened the gas valve without producing a flame, and stepped back. The burner sat there with gas flowing silently into the kitchen. Vanessa pulled her phone from her back pocket. She held it up and filmed for 38 seconds the stove, the kitchen, the back door through which Evelyn had just left. Then she turned the burner back off, put her phone away, and walked back down the hallway. 2 minutes and 40 seconds after that, Evelyn came back inside for a glass of water, completely unaware. I watched that clip 4 times. Then I moved forward in the archive and found the second one on day 5. Hallway camera this time. 3:47 in the afternoon. Vanessa walked to the hallway bathroom, turned the cold water faucet at the sink to full, and pulled the door mostly closed behind her. The sink was a standard basin at full flow. It would overflow onto the floor in approximately 4 minutes. I had installed a small lip at the base of the bathroom door in 2016 to prevent water damage after a previous incident, so the overflow would be contained to the bathroom itself, but it would look bad. It would look like someone had left the water running and forgotten. 4 minutes and 23 seconds later, Evelyn walked past the bathroom, heard the water open the door, and turned off the faucet. She stood in the bathroom doorway, looking at the wet floor with her hand over her mouth. Vanessa appeared from the end of the hallway 18 seconds after that. Her phone was already recording. "It's okay, Evelyn," she said on the footage, her voice warm and gentle. "These things happen." I pushed back from the workbench and stood up. I walked to the far end of the garage and stood facing the wall with my hands on my hips and breathed for a while. The rage that moved through me was clean and cold, not hot, the kind that does not make you want to break things, but makes you very certain about what needs to happen next. I have felt it a handful of times in my life. It is quieter than anger and considerably more useful. I went back to the stool and called Carol Simmons. Carol had worked alongside Evelyn at Sunridge Cleaning Services for 11 years before Evelyn cut back her hours. They had been partners on the West Side residential route for most of that time, same car, same houses, same clients, twice a week for over a decade. If anyone outside this family knew the actual state of Evelyn's mind, it was Carol. She picked up on the second ring. "Harrison, everything okay? I need to ask you something directly," I said. "About Evelyn." A pause. "Of course. Her memory, her judgment. How is she in your honest opinion?" Carol did not hesitate. "She called me last Thursday to remind me about the Hendersons' cat allergy before I covered their house, a client she hasn't personally serviced in 4 months. She remembered the cat's name." A beat. "Harrison, that woman knows exactly what she is doing and where she is. I would stake my paycheck on it. Has she seemed confused to you recently, forgetful in ways that concern you?" "No." "Should I be worried?" "No," I said. I just needed to hear it from someone who would tell me the truth. After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Outside the garage door, I could hear the sprinklers in Dennis's yard clicking on for the evening cycle, and further down the block, a kid on a bicycle, and the ordinary sounds of Reseda at 6 o'clock on a Monday. The world going about itself with no idea what was being constructed inside this house. I called Marcus. "I found 2 incidents," I said when he picked up. "Gas burner on day 3, faucet on day 5. Both staged by the same person. Clear footage, good resolution, timestamps intact." A pause on his end that I recognized as the pause of a man recalibrating. "Are you certain it's her and not Evelyn?" "Evelyn was outside both times. The footage shows her leaving and returning. The other person is alone in frame for both incidents. Harrison." Marcus's voice shifted into the register he uses when he is no longer speaking carefully, when he is speaking plainly. "Keep watching. Document everything you find. And do not change anything in that house. Not one camera angle, not one setting. Whatever they are planning, let them finish planning it." He paused again. "And Harrison, call Officer Torres at the Devonshire Division. She runs the Neighborhood Watch Liaison. Tell her what you have, and that you may need her in the coming days. Not officially. Just so she knows. I wrote down the name. Torres, Devonshire Division." Through the gap under the garage door, I could see the last of the evening light going orange across the driveway. Inside the house, I could hear Evelyn moving around the kitchen getting dinner started. The sound of cabinet doors opening and closing, water running, the ordinary sounds of a house that still belonged to us. I closed the laptop and went inside to help her set the table. Before I go any further, if you are still here with me, drop the word "strong" in the comments right now. I want to know who is standing by. Because what is about to walk through my front door next changes everything, and I need to know you are ready for it. A small note. The story ahead contains some fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes, If that is not for you, no hard feelings at all. I was on my second cup of coffee when the SUV pulled up. Black Chevrolet Tahoe Nevada, plates a long crack running diagonally across the lower passenger side of the windshield that someone had sealed with clear tape and never repaired. It parked in front of the house at 8:22 in the morning, with the engine running for almost a full minute before the door opened. The woman who stepped out was around 50, dressed in pressed linen slacks and a silk blouse that belonged in a different zip code than mine. She wore sunglasses she did not take off when she looked up at the house, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with her hand on the door of the Tahoe, and looked at our home the way people look at things they are deciding whether to bother with. Then she walked to the back of the vehicle and pulled a rolling suitcase from the trunk. I set my mug down. Vanessa was at the front door before I reached the hallway. She pulled it open and stepped outside, and the two women embraced on the porch with the ease of people who see each other constantly and do not need the embrace to mean anything. The woman said something low that I could not hear. Vanessa laughed. "Harrison." Vanessa turned with her arm still around the woman's waist. "This is my mom, Victoria. I mentioned she might visit." She had not mentioned any such thing. "Victoria," I said. Victoria Caldwell took off her sunglasses and looked at me with light brown eyes that were sharp in the way of someone who makes assessments quickly and does not often revise them. She extended her hand. "Harrison, Vanessa talks about you constantly." Her grip was brief and deliberate. "What a lovely neighborhood." She said lovely the way people say quaint when they mean small. I stepped back from the door. "Come in." She came in and did what Vanessa had done 4 days earlier, moved through the rooms with her eyes doing more work than her feet. She stopped in the living room doorway and looked at the built-in shelving, the fireplace, the bay window that faces the backyard. She ran one finger along the mantelpiece and looked at the tip of her finger afterward. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. 28 years. She turned to look at the ceiling. "Good bones." Evelyn came out of the kitchen drying her hands on a dish towel, and the warmth she extended to Victoria Caldwell was the same warmth she extends to everyone, genuine, immediate, and completely undeserved in this case. She offered coffee. She offered the guest room across from Julian and Vanessa's room. She said it was no trouble at all, that there was plenty of space, that she was glad Vanessa had family nearby. I watched all of this from the hallway and said nothing. Victoria accepted the coffee and the room and smiled at Evelyn with the practiced ease of a woman who has spent decades letting other people's generosity carry her where she wanted to go. That afternoon, I went to the hardware store on Sherman Way and bought 2 additional Nest camera units. The living room had no camera. I had prioritized the kitchen, the hallway, and the exterior doors when I installed the system 2 years ago. Under California Penal Code Section 632, recording conversations in private spaces without consent is illegal. But the living room is a common area of the home, and recording video in your own common areas, even when guests are present, does not require their consent. I had confirmed this with Marcus. I installed the first new unit above the bookshelf near the television, angled to cover the sofa and the seating area. I installed the second in the hallway junction, covering the path between the guest rooms and the living room. I did it while Evelyn took Victoria to see the garden, and Vanessa and Julian were out. I was back in the kitchen with my hands washed and a pot of chili on the stove before anyone came inside. That evening, after dinner, after Evelyn had gone to bed and Julian had retreated to the guest room, Victoria and Vanessa sat together in the living room. I could hear their voices from the kitchen where I was washing up, not the words, just the cadence. Low, deliberate, the rhythm of people talking through something with a purpose. I dried my hands. I went to the garage and opened my laptop. The new living room camera had been recording for 4 hours. I skipped to the evening footage. 9:14 p.m. Victoria leaned toward Vanessa on the sofa, her voice low but the audio on the Nest unit clean enough to carry. The bag was never going to be enough. You knew that going in. Vanessa, I know. But I thought if we got her emotional about it, it doesn't matter. Victoria cut her off with a flat, efficient gesture. The house is what matters. That's where the real money is. You get the house and the debt problem solves itself. A pause. He won't be easy. He's not the type. Vanessa. I have something on her. The incidents. I've been building it. Victoria. How much do you have, Vanessa? Enough to file. Maybe enough to get a temporary conservator appointed while the petition moves through the court. Victoria nodded slowly. Then we move Sunday. She glanced toward the hallway, toward the bedrooms. These people are not fighters, Vanessa. They are the kind who open the door and offer you coffee. Her voice dropped another register. People like that give in when they understand there is no other option. I closed the laptop. I sat in the garage for a long time with my hands flat on the workbench, looking at nothing. 28 years I had lived in this house. 31 years I had worked with my hands to build something worth keeping. And 2 women were sitting in my living room tonight, deciding Sunday was the day they would take it. I picked up my phone and called Ray in San Diego. He answered on the first ring, and before I could say more than his name, he said, "Is this about Vanessa?" Ray called back at 6:47 in the morning. I was already at the kitchen table. I had slept maybe 3 hours, and the sleep I had gotten was the shallow kind that leaves you more tired than if you had stayed awake. The coffee was strong and the kitchen was gray with early light, and I picked up on the first ring. I should have told you before the wedding, Ray said. He did not say good morning. Ray has never been a man who wastes time getting to the point. 65 years old retired pipe fitter, lives alone in a small house in Chula Vista, south of San Diego, has strong opinions about the designated hitter rule, and very few other things. He is the only person in my life who is more direct than I am. I thought she had left it behind. I was wrong, and I'm sorry for that. Tell me what you know, I said. He told me. Before Vanessa married Julian, she had been married for 6 months to a man named Derek Marsh in Henderson, Nevada, a suburb of Las Vegas. Derek was a general contractor, owned his own business, lived with his widowed father in a house the father had owned since 1979. The marriage had gone wrong quickly in the particular way marriages go wrong when one person enters them with a purpose that has nothing to do with the other person. Within 3 months, Vanessa and Victoria, who had been staying with the couple since month 2, had begun pressuring Derek's father about the house. Suggestions that the old man was becoming unsafe living alone. Comments about his memory. A campaign of small incidents that Derek had not understood the significance of until it was nearly too late. Derek had figured it out when he found Victoria on the phone with a family law attorney asking about conservatorship procedures in Nevada. He had confronted Vanessa. The marriage ended the same week. How did you find out? I asked. Linda's cousin knew Derek's sister, Ray said. Linda was Ray's ex-wife. They had divorced in 2019 but remained friendly in the way people do when the marriage ends without malice. Derek's sister told Linda's cousin the whole story at some birthday party in Reno 2 years ago. Linda told me. I filed it away because I thought... He stopped. I thought people changed. I thought maybe Vanessa had just been young and desperate and had learned something from how badly it ended. I did not think she would do it again. She's doing it again, I said. A pause on Ray's end. Long enough that I heard him exhale through his nose. I know. That's why I asked, is this about Vanessa when you called last night? Because I've been thinking about it since Julian told me they were moving in with you. Another pause. Harrison, I'm sorry. You deserved to know before any of this started. What I need from you now, I said, is Derek Marsh's contact information. And I need you to be willing to repeat what you just told me if it becomes necessary. Derek's in Henderson still. I'll get you his number through Linda. And yes, whatever you need. Whatever this becomes. We hung up. I set the phone on the table and looked at the kitchen window. Outside, the morning was coming in properly, now the particular flat white light of San Fernando Valley mornings before the sun gets high enough to turn everything gold. Evelyn was still asleep. The house was quiet. I thought about Derek Marsh's father in Henderson, Nevada. An old man in a house he had owned since 1979, a house that had held his life the way this house held mine. He had almost lost it. He had gotten lucky because his son had been paying enough attention to see what was happening before the machinery had fully engaged. I was paying attention. I picked up the phone and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring. I told him about Ray's call, the Nevada marriage, Derek's father, Victoria, on the phone with a Nevada family law attorney, the same pattern run against a different family 6 years earlier. Marcus listened without interrupting, which is how I know he is treating something seriously. When I finished, he said, "Pattern evidence." That's significant, Harrison. In a criminal elder abuse case, prior similar conduct, especially conduct involving the same individuals, goes directly to the question of intent. It demonstrates that what's happening in your home is not impulsive or situational. It is deliberate and repeated. A pause. I want Ray's account documented. Written statement signed and dated before Sunday. Can you get that? I'll drive to Chula Vista tomorrow if I have to. Good. And the Nevada man Derek Marsh, if he is willing to provide a statement as well, that is additional corroboration. Another pause, and then Marcus said the thing I had been turning over in my mind since I hung up with Ray. Harrison, with what you have now, the footage, Ray's account, the Nevada history, if they proceed Sunday, the way that footage suggests they are not just exposing themselves to civil liability. They are walking into a criminal case that has their fingerprints on it, going back years. I know, I said. Let them walk into it. After I hung up, I sat at the table for another few minutes without moving. Then I stood and went to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. Evelyn had come outside while I was on the phone. I had not heard her. She was in her garden coat, the old green one with the frayed left cuff she refuses to replace, moving along the row of tomato plants she had been coaxing along since April. She was talking to them the way she always does, asking after them, telling them the weather was going to hold a few more weeks, encouraging them in a voice she reserves for plants and grandchildren. Her hands moved through the leaves with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what she is doing. The morning light caught the silver in her hair. She reached the end of the row and turned back, and she was talking to the plants again, asking the tomatoes how they were getting on, the way she does when she is content, and the world is in its right order as far as she can tell. I watched her for a long time. There are things you work for with your hands, and things you work for with your life. The house was one kind. She was the other. I was not going to let anyone take either one. That afternoon, Evelyn called me into the bedroom. She wanted to show me something she had kept under the bed. She was sitting on the edge of the bed when I came in, her hands folded in her lap, her posture carrying the particular quality of someone who has been rehearsing how to say something and is still not sure they have it right. The afternoon light came through the curtains at a low angle and settled across the quilt in strips of amber and shadow. "Close the door," she said. I closed it. I sat in the chair by the window, the one I use when I read at night. I waited. Evelyn reached down and pulled a small metal box from under the bed. It was the size of a shoebox, painted green, once though most of the paint had worn away at the corners, to reveal the dull gray steel underneath. She set it on her knees and looked at it for a moment. before she looked at me. "I should have told you about this a long time ago," she said. "Okay, I'm not telling you now because I think you'll be angry. I'm telling you because—" She stopped. She opened the box. Inside were bills folded in half and stacked in small groups held together with rubber bands. 20s, mostly some 50s, arranged with a neatness that told me she had organized and reorganized them more than once. Because Julian is in trouble. I've known for longer than he thinks I have, and I want to help him. I looked at the money. I looked at my wife's face. I did not speak yet because I was not sure my voice would come out correctly. I've been setting aside a little every week since I started the cleaning job," she said. $30 sometimes, $50 when we had a good month. Carol covers for me when the supervisor asks why my hours don't match my deposits. I told her I was saving up for something personal, and she never pushed. She smoothed one hand over the top bill, the way you smooth a letter you have already sealed. "I know it isn't much. I know it won't fix everything. But I thought if I could give Julian something real, something he could hold in his hands, maybe it would help him start over instead of whatever this is." "How much?" I asked. $3,040. $3,040. Saved $30 at a time, $50 at a time over years of Wednesday and Friday. Shifts cleaning other people's houses on the west side, carrying her own supplies upstairs in a bag she bought herself because the company's bag hurt her shoulder. $3,040 in a rusted green metal box under our bed, organized with rubber bands rehearsed. I reached out and covered her hands with mine. The box was between us, still on her knees, and I held her hands around it and did not say anything for a while, because there was nothing to say that would be equal to what she had just shown me. "You should have told me," I said finally. "I know." Her voice was small. "I didn't want you to worry. I didn't want you to feel like we needed to fix something." She looked down at our hands. "He's our son, Harrison. He made mistakes. I don't want him to drown." "He won't drown," I said. She looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying. Evelyn cries when she is moved, not when she is sad, and what she was feeling right now was too complicated to be only sadness. "Do you promise?" "I promise." We sat like that for a few minutes. Then she put the lid back on the box, and I carried it to the dresser and set it there in plain sight, because it had been under the bed long enough. At 4 o'clock, Carol Simmons knocked on the front door. She was a tall woman, Carol, with gray braids she wore pinned up and a laugh that could carry across a parking lot. She had brought a container of the lemon bars she makes for every occasion, because she believes there is no human situation that lemon bars cannot make more manageable, a philosophy I have come to agree with over the years. Evelyn's face changed when she opened the door. Not the polite warmth she had given Victoria, something older and easier than that. The warmth of someone who does not have to think about being warm. I made myself scarce. I went to the garage and let them have the kitchen. But I left the door between the garage and the hallway cracked. Not to eavesdrop, but because the sound of Evelyn talking the way she actually talks, fast, specific, full of details, laughing at the right moments and asking follow-up questions, was something I needed to hear right then. She talked about Mrs. Dunleavy's new wallpaper in the Brentwood house. She talked about the mockingbird that had been nesting in our orange tree since August and what it had done to Dennis's car one morning. She remembered the exact date Carol's youngest had started at Cal State Northridge. She asked after the knee Carol had been having trouble with since June and whether the physical therapist on Ventura had helped. After about 40 minutes, I heard the front door and then footsteps on the porch. And then Carol's voice through the window above my workbench. "Harrison." I stepped outside. Carol was standing on the porch with her empty container and her car keys. And she looked at me with the directness of a woman who has worked alongside my wife for 11 years and has earned the right to say what she thinks. "She's sharp as ever," Carol said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She held my eyes for a moment to make sure I understood she was not just making conversation. "Whatever is happening in this house, she is not the weak point. You understand me." "I understand you," I said. Carol nodded once and walked to her car. I stood on the porch until her taillights turned off Vanowen. Then I went back inside and looked at the green metal box sitting on top of our dresser in the afternoon light, $3,040 of $30 increments. And I thought about Sunday, which was 4 days away. I was ready. I woke at 4:53 and did not try to go back to sleep. I lay still for a few minutes, with my eyes open in the dark, listening to the house. Evelyn's breathing beside me, slow and even. The refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen. The particular silence of a Sunday before the neighborhood decides to be awake. Then I got up carefully without disturbing her and went to the garage. I sat in the garage until 6:30 with a cup of coffee and my phone and the Nest app open on my laptop. I reviewed the footage from the living room camera one more time. Victoria and Vanessa on the sofa 9 days ago. The conversation I had watched a dozen times by now. I reviewed the kitchen footage from day 3 and the hallway footage from day 5. I looked at the screenshot of the Facebook Marketplace listing. I read through the debt letters from Summit Bridge Capital and the 2 banks which I had kept in a folder on the workbench. I had called Marcus on Thursday to confirm everything was in order. Ray's written statement had arrived by email Friday morning, signed and dated 3 pages detailing what he knew about Nevada and Derek Marsh and Victoria's involvement. Marcus had it. I had a copy. Derek Marsh had agreed by phone to provide a corroborating statement if needed. I closed the laptop. I finished my coffee. I went inside and showered and dressed and made a full breakfast: eggs, toast, orange juice, because I did not know when I would next have the appetite to eat properly. And I have always believed in going into difficult situations with something solid in your stomach. Evelyn came to the kitchen at 7:30. She looked at the breakfast and looked at me and said, "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I said. She sat down and ate with me and talked about the mockingbird in the orange tree which had begun its morning routine at 4:30 and had not let up. She was wearing the green cardigan she wears on Sunday mornings. She had her hair pinned up the way she does when she is not going anywhere. She looked like every Sunday morning of the 28 years we had lived in this house. I wanted to tell her. I had been going back and forth about it since Wednesday, but I had decided finally that telling her before would mean she would spend the morning bracing herself, and Evelyn deserves better than spending a Sunday morning bracing for something. She would know soon enough. And when she knew, she would not be alone. At 8:55 I heard the guest room doors open, both of them within 30 seconds of each other. I refilled my coffee and carried it to the living room and sat in my chair, the one by the window, the one I have sat in to read and think and watch the backyard for 28 years. I set the mug on the side table. I folded my hands in my lap. Victoria came out first. She was dressed as though she were going somewhere formal, pressed blouse slacks with a crease, the gold earrings she had worn every day since she arrived. She looked at me sitting in my chair, and something moved briefly in her expression before she arranged it into the neutral pleasantness she wore like a uniform. "Good morning, Harrison." "Morning." Vanessa came out behind her mother. She was carrying the folder, a manila folder thick, held together with a binder clip. She set it on the coffee table in front of me without preamble, without greeting, without the performance of politeness she had maintained for the first week. The time for performance was apparently over. Julian came last. He stood in the entrance to the living room with his hands in the pockets of his jeans and did not sit down. He did not look at me. Vanessa sat on the sofa across from me. Victoria sat beside her. The folder lay on the table between us. "We need to talk about something practical," Vanessa said. Her voice had the quality of someone reading from a script they have memorized well enough that it sounds almost natural. "We've been thinking about what makes the most sense for everyone going forward, and we want to present something we hope you'll consider seriously." She reached forward and opened the folder. Inside was a document several pages stapled with lines for signatures at the bottom of the last page. She turned it to face me and slid it across the table. It was a property transfer agreement. My name, Evelyn's name, the address of this house on Vanawan Street, a proposed sale price that was $60,000 below current market value, with a notation that the proceeds would be distributed in a manner to be agreed upon separately. There was a line for my signature. There was a line for Evelyn's. I looked at it without touching it. Evelyn has been having a difficult time," Vanessa continued. "We've all seen it. The gas, the water, these are safety issues, Harrison. We're not saying this to be cruel. We're saying it because we're worried. A smaller place, something on one level, without the maintenance demands of a property this size, it would be better for her. Better for both of you." Victoria leaned forward. "And if you won't consider it voluntarily, we do have the option of petitioning the court. There is documented evidence of capacity concerns. A judge would appoint a conservator to assess the situation and make recommendations about the property." She said it the way people deliver an ultimatum they have practiced flat, even calibrated to sound like reluctant necessity rather than threat. Julian said nothing. He was looking at the floor 12 inches in front of his feet. I looked at the document on the table. I looked at the signature lines with my name above them. I looked at Victoria's face and Vanessa's face and the folder and the careful, practiced architecture of everything they had built toward this moment. Then I stood up. I picked up my coffee mug. I walked to the kitchen doorway and stopped. I looked back at the three of them, at Vanessa with her folder, at Victoria with her calibrated voice, at my son who could not find a place to put his eyes. "Evelyn," I said, "go sit in the living room, please." She looked up from the counter where she had been listening, and something in her face told me she had been listening for longer than I had realized. She set down her dish towel. She walked to the living room and sat in her chair, the smaller one by the bookshelf, the one that has been hers since we bought the furniture in 1999. I reached up to the shelf above the microwave where I keep the small remote control for the television. I pressed the power button. From the living room, I heard the television turn on. Before I show you what was on that screen, before I reveal what I had been sitting on for 2 weeks, while they made their plans, drop the number 60 in the comments. 60 seconds. That is all it took to change everything in that living room. Stay with me. And a note before we continue: some details in what follows are fictional, crafted for educational storytelling. If this kind of content is not for you, this is a good place to step away. The television in my living room is a 55-inch Samsung that Evelyn and I bought 6 years ago, when the old one finally gave out. It is not a fancy television. It does what we need it to do: morning news, Sunday baseball, the occasional movie. But that Sunday morning, it did something I had never used it for before. I had connected the Nest system to the television's input too the previous Thursday, while everyone was out of the house. It took 11 minutes. I had tested it twice to make sure the footage loaded cleanly and the timestamps were visible. I had cued the 2 clips I needed and saved the start point so that pressing play from the kitchen remote would go directly to the first frame without any navigation required. I pressed play from the kitchen remote. I walked back to the living room doorway and leaned against the frame with my coffee mug and watched. On the screen, the kitchen camera timestamp in the upper right corner, date and time in white numerals against the black border. The footage showed Evelyn pulling on her gardening gloves at the counter, Evelyn going out the back door. The kitchen empty for 17 seconds. Then Vanessa walking in from the hallway, moving to the stove, turning the front left burner knob. No ignition click. Gas flowing silently. Vanessa stepping back, pulling out her phone, filming for 38 seconds. Turning the knob back off. Walking away. The living room was so quiet, I could hear the mockingbird outside in the orange tree. Vanessa's face had gone the color of old chalk. Her jaw was tight, and her hands were pressed flat against her thighs, the knuckles pale. Victoria had leaned forward with both elbows on her knees and was staring at the screen with her lips pressed together into a thin, colorless line. Julian had turned from the entrance of the living room to face the television, and his mouth was open in the particular way of someone whose mind has arrived somewhere faster than his expression has caught up. The first clip ended. The second began automatically. Hallway camera. Vanessa at the bathroom door, faucet turned to full door, pulled mostly closed. 4 minutes, 23 seconds of empty hallway. Evelyn walking past, stopping, opening the door, finding the running water. Her hand going over her mouth. And then Vanessa appearing from the far end of the hall, phone already raised. "It's okay, Evelyn. These things happen." I reached over and pressed pause. I installed that system 2 years ago," I said, "before any of you moved into this house. 4 cameras covering every common area. Motion activated, cloud storage, 60 days of rolling footage." I looked at Vanessa. "All of it legal. California law permits video recording in common areas of a private residence without the consent of guests. I confirmed that with my attorney." Vanessa's voice came out with an edge that was working hard to sound like outrage and landing closer to panic. "You recorded us without telling us. You had no right to." "I had every right," I said. "This is my home. You are a guest in it. What you did not have the right to do is what is on that screen." That's not what it looks like. Vanessa." I said her name the way you say a word when you want it to land without anything attached to it. Just the word. Just the weight of it. I have watched those clips 14 times. I know exactly what it looks like. Victoria stood up. She had recovered faster than her daughter, which told me something about how many times she had been in rooms where things had gone wrong and had needed to find her footing quickly. "This doesn't change anything," she said. Her voice was controlled again, the flat, practiced control of the ultimatum she had delivered 20 minutes ago. "You have a home video of Vanessa in your kitchen. That is not evidence of anything. What we have is documented incidents of cognitive decline, and we will take that to a judge regardless of." I took my phone out of my pocket. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from the doorway. I opened the phone, found Marcus Webb's number in my contacts, and pressed call. When he answered, I said, "Marcus, I need you on speaker. We're having the conversation we talked about." A brief pause. Then, "Put me on." I switched to speaker and held the phone up so the room could hear. Marcus's voice was calm and clear, and carried the particular authority of someone who has spent 37 years choosing words that mean exactly what he needs them to mean. "Good morning. I'm Marcus Webb, attorney at law representing Harrison Vance. I want to make sure everyone in that room understands the legal situation clearly, because I think there may be some confusion about what options are actually available to you." Victoria's chin came up. "We have our own legal counsel." "Then I'd encourage you to call them right now," Marcus said. "Because what is on that footage constitutes deliberate staging of dangerous conditions in order to manufacture evidence of cognitive decline with the intent to initiate conservatorship proceedings and gain control of real property. Under California Penal Code Section 368, that is criminal elder abuse. A felony. Not a civil matter, a felony." A pause. "The footage has timestamps. It has been backed up to cloud storage that neither of you can access or alter. It has been reviewed by law enforcement, and there is additional evidence of prior similar conduct involving the same individuals in another state. The room was very still. Julian's face had changed completely. The last of whatever posture he had been maintaining since he walked into the living room 40 minutes ago had left him. He was looking at Vanessa with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not anger, not hurt, something colder and more final than either. The expression of a man who has just understood something he cannot ununderstand. Vanessa opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at the phone in my hand. Then she looked at the television screen still paused on the hallway footage, Evelyn's hand frozen over her mouth in the bathroom doorway. She sat back down. What happens next? Marcus continued, is up to you. But I want to be very clear about what does not happen next. No one in that room files any petition regarding Evelyn Vance's cognitive capacity. No one contacts any court on the basis of the footage Vanessa recorded. And no one presents any further documents to Harrison Vance for signature under duress. Another pause, shorter. Do we understand each other? No one in the living room said anything. Through the window, I could see Dennis Park's sprinklers running in his front yard, turning slow arcs in the Sunday morning light. Ordinary, patient, completely indifferent to what was happening inside my house. Harrison, Marcus said. I'd suggest calling Officer Torres now. Already on it, I said. Marcus stayed on the line. Nobody in the living room spoke while we waited. Victoria sat with her hands clasped on her knee, looking at a point on the wall slightly above the television. Vanessa had pulled her phone out and was staring at the screen without appearing to actually see anything on it. Julian had moved from the entrance to the living room and was sitting on the arm of the sofa nearest the window, as far from Vanessa as the room allowed, his forearms resting on his thighs, his hands hanging open between his knees. Evelyn sat in her chair by the bookshelf with her hands folded in her lap. She was watching room the way she watches things she has decided to understand fully before she responds to them. 23 minutes after I called her, Officer Diane Torres knocked twice and opened the front door. She was in uniform, dark navy badge on the chest, the measured, unhurried movement of someone trained to enter rooms where the temperature is already high and not raise it further. She had been the neighborhood watch liaison for the Devonshire Division's Reseda sector for 6 years. I had met her at a block association meeting in 2021 and had called her Thursday to explain what I expected might happen Sunday. She had listened without interrupting and said she would make herself available. She looked around the room, once taking in the positions and faces the way she had been trained to do, and then looked at me. Mr. Vance? Officer Torres. Thank you for coming. I walked her through it in 3 minutes, the footage on the television, Marcus on the phone, the document on the coffee table. Torres watched both clips on the paused television without comment. She picked up the property transfer agreement by the corner, read the first page, set it back down. Then Marcus spoke from the phone in my hand. Officer Torres, I'm Marcus Webb, Mr. Vance's attorney. The footage you've just viewed was recorded on a Nest security system installed by Mr. Vance 2 years prior to the events shown. Recording in common areas of a private residence in California does not require guest consent under state law. The footage has been cloud-backed and has not been altered. Torres nodded once. She looked at Victoria. Ma'am, I want to make sure you understand what you're looking at here. Deliberately staging hazardous conditions in a residence occupied by an elderly person with the purpose of creating a false record of cognitive impairment and using that record to pursue legal control of their assets that conduct falls under California Penal Code Section 368, elder abuse. It is a felony offense. She said it without heat, without theater. Simply the law stated plainly in a room where it needed to be stated. Victoria's jaw tightened. We have not done anything illegal. We have concerns about Evelyn's well-being and we were exploring our options. Your options, I said, included coming to me directly. They included asking Evelyn how she was doing. They did not include turning on the gas in my kitchen. Vanessa started to say something. I looked at her and she stopped. I reached into the drawer of the side table and took out the small notebook I had been keeping since the day they moved in. Green cover, wire-bound, the kind I use for job estimates at the shop. I opened it to the first page and set it on the coffee table next to the property transfer document. And every week since Julian and Vanessa moved in, I said. Groceries, utilities, gas for Julian's car. Vanessa's dry cleaning, twice the cable bill, which went up when we added their streaming accounts. All of it paid from our retirement account. I looked at Julian. 100% of their living costs. Not one contribution from either of them. Julian looked at the notebook. His throat moved. I raised you, I said. It was not an accusation. It was a fact stated the way I state facts plainly, without ornamentation, because the plain version is always sufficient. 30 years. Everything I had. I did that because that is what a father does. I paused. Is this what a son does? Julian's eyes went red at the rims. He pressed his lips together and looked away. Vanessa straightened on the sofa and lifted her chin. I am doing what is best for my family, she said. Everything I have done has been for Julian, for our future. This house is sitting here with two people who don't need all of it, and we are drowning, and all I was trying to do was find a solution that worked for everyone. I looked at her. I waited one beat. My brother spoke to Derek Marsh, I said. In Henderson, Nevada. The man you were married to for 6 months before you married my son. Vanessa's face went very still. He told my brother what happened to his father's house, what you and your mother tried to do there. I let that sit in the air of the room for a moment. Same plan, same people, different house. Victoria looked at the floor. Vanessa did not speak. Her mouth was slightly open, and she was looking at me with an expression that had passed through shock and arrived somewhere beyond it, the look of someone who has just understood that the ground they were standing on was not what they believed it to be. Torres was writing something in her notepad. She did not look up while she wrote. Marcus spoke from the phone. Officer Torres, Mr. Vance's brother, has provided a signed written statement regarding the Nevada incident. A corroborating statement from the individual directly affected is also being obtained. I'll have both to you by end of day. Understood, Torres said. She capped her pen and looked at Victoria and Vanessa. I'm going to need some information from both of you before you leave today. Then Evelyn stood up. She stood up from her chair by the bookshelf slowly, the way she always stands, without hurrying, without drama. She walked to the hallway and came back a moment later, carrying the green metal box. She set it on the coffee table next to the property transfer document and the green notebook. She opened the lid. The bills were stacked in small bundles held together with rubber bands, 20s, mostly some 50s, organized with a care that told you they had been counted and recounted many times. $3,040. Not a fortune. Not enough to make a dent in $180,000 of debt. But that was not the point, and everyone in the room understood that it was not the point. Evelyn did not look at Victoria. She did not look at Vanessa or at Torres or at me. She looked at Julian. Baby, she said. Her voice was quiet and without accusation, the way it is when she has decided that a thing needs to be said, and that saying it gently is not the same as saying it weakly. I know you're in trouble. I've known for longer than you think. She lifted the stack of bills from the box and held it out toward him. I saved this, a little at a time for a long time. It's not enough. I know it's not enough, but I want you to have it. She paused. Take it. Pay what you can. And stop fighting your father. Julian looked at the money in his mother's hands. He looked at it the way you look at something that costs you more to accept than to refuse. Because accepting it means acknowledging what it represents, and what it represented was his mother on her knees in other people's houses on Wednesday and Friday mornings, carrying her own supply bag, because the company's bag hurt her shoulder, setting aside $30 a week for years, so that someday, if her son needed it, she would have something real to give him. His hands came up slowly. He was going to take it. Vanessa moved first. She reached across the coffee table and closed her fingers around the stack of bills before Julian's hands reached his mother's. She did not snatch, she simply took with the smooth efficiency of someone who has decided that speed matters more than appearances. She straightened up and looked at the money in her hand, and then looked at Evelyn. $3,000, she said. Her voice had that flat quality that lives just below contempt. Evelyn, we owe $180,000. What exactly is $3,000 supposed to do? The room went very still. Not the still of people who have nothing to say. The still of people who have too much to say and are deciding whether to say any of it. I watched Evelyn's face. She did not flinch. She did not look away from Vanessa. She simply looked at her, the woman who had come into her home, eaten at her table, taken her bag, staged incidents in her kitchen to make her look confused, and was now standing in her living room, holding her savings in one hand, and explaining why it was insufficient. Evelyn looked at her with an expression that was not anger and not hurt. It was something quieter and more final than either. The expression of a woman who has arrived after some time at a complete understanding of what she is looking at. I know it isn't enough, Evelyn said. I said that. Then why? Because he's my son. Evelyn's voice did not rise. It did not need to. That's why. That is the only reason I need. Torres shifted her weight near the doorway. She had her notepad open, but she was not writing. She was watching. I looked at Julian. He was looking at the money in Vanessa's hand. Then he looked at his mother's empty hands, still slightly extended, the gesture not quite finished. Then he looked at Vanessa's face, at the flat, calculating expression she was wearing while she held his mother's savings and explained their inadequacy. Something moved through Julian's face that I had not seen there before. Not the guilt I had watched him carry for weeks, not the exhaustion, not the willful blindness that had allowed him to stand in hallways and look at his shoes while things happened around him. This was something being extinguished. Some last remaining arrangement he had made with himself about what his wife was and what she was capable of, going out like a pilot light in a cold kitchen. He took a breath. His hands, which had been hanging open at his sides, closed slowly into fists and then opened again. Vanessa was still talking. She was making an argument about financial reality and the limits of sentiment and the difference between symbolic gestures and practical solutions, and her voice had the momentum of someone who has made this argument before and found it effective, who believes that if you keep talking long enough and calmly enough, the other person will eventually concede the logic of your position. She did not notice that Julian had stopped listening. She noticed when he stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for her. He stepped between his mother and his wife directly into Vanessa's line of sight, close enough that she had to stop talking simply because there was no longer any space for the words to go. He held out his hand, palm up, fingers flat. Vanessa looked at his hand. She looked at his face. Whatever she saw there made her stop. She placed the money in his hand. Not because she wanted to, because something in the quality of his stillness had communicated that the alternative was something she did not want to find out about. Julian turned. He set the stack of bills carefully back into his mother's hands. He closed her fingers around it. He kept his hands over hers for a moment, his large, rough hands over her small ones, the box still open on the table between them. Then he turned back to face his wife. "Chère Vanessa," he said. One word. Her name. But the voice it came out in was not a voice I had heard from my son before. It was not the tired voice or the defensive voice or the voice of a man managing a situation. It was the voice of a man who has reached the bottom of something and found unexpectedly that the bottom is solid. Vanessa looked at her husband's face and understood that something had changed in a way that could not be unchanged. She opened her mouth. Julian spoke first. "I'm done." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The absence of heat in it was more final than anger would have been. "I'm done with this. All of it." He looked at his wife, and then at his mother-in-law, and then back at his wife. "Get out of my parents' house. Right now. Both of you." Victoria stood up from the sofa. "Julian, you need to think about what you're—" "I have been thinking." He turned to look at her, and something in the directness of it stopped her mid-sentence. "I have been thinking for 8 months. I thought my way into debt, and I thought my way into this house, and I thought my way through every conversation where I should have said something and didn't. I am done thinking, and I am telling you to leave." Vanessa's voice came out sharp and compressed the voice of someone applying pressure to something that is slipping. "You can't just, we are married, Julian. You don't get to decide." "I'm filing on Monday," he said. "California, no fault. I don't need a reason beyond this room." He looked at her steadily. "I have one anyway." The word "no fault" landed in the room with the weight of something that had been looked up, considered, and decided upon. Not an impulsive declaration, a conclusion. Vanessa's chin trembled once. Then her jaw tightened, and the trembling stopped, and what replaced it was something harder and colder, the expression of a woman rearranging herself around a loss she had not accounted for. Torres stepped forward from the doorway. Not between anyone, simply into the room, making her presence more present. "Ma'am," she said to Victoria, her voice carrying the particular neutrality of someone whose authority does not require volume. "I think it would be in your best interest to collect your things." Victoria looked at Torres. She looked at Julian. She looked at me standing in the kitchen doorway, and I gave her nothing, because I had nothing to give her, and no interest in giving her anything. She reached down and picked up her purse from the floor beside the sofa and walked to the hallway without speaking. Vanessa stood for a moment longer. She looked at Julian with an expression that cycled through several things quickly. An appeal, a recalculation, something that might have been genuine hurt beneath the architecture of everything else. And then she followed her mother. I listened to them moving through the guest room. Drawers, closet doors, the zip of a suitcase. It took 11 minutes, which is not very long, to pack up the remains of a plan that had been months in the making. Torres stood in the hallway while they brought their bags out. She did not help, and she did not hinder. She was simply there in uniform, making the exit official in the way that a witness makes things official without saying a word. I opened the front door. The morning was bright and ordinary. The San Fernando Valley on a Sunday in late October. The kind of morning that does not know or care what is happening inside the houses it is shining on. Dennis Park was at his mailbox across the low hedge that divides our properties. He straightened up when the door opened and stood there with his mail in his hand, taking in the suitcases, the uniform, the general atmosphere of conclusion. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He just stood there the way neighbors stand when they are bearing witness to something they understand, without being told. Victoria went down the porch steps first, wheeling her suitcase without looking back. Vanessa followed. At the bottom of the steps, Vanessa paused and turned, and I thought she might say something to me, to Julian, to Evelyn, to anyone. She looked at the house for a moment. Then she turned away and walked to the Tahoe. The engine started. The Nevada plates moved away down Vanoan Street and did not stop. Torres came to stand beside me on the porch. "I'll have a report filed today," she said. "With what's on that footage and the witness statements your attorney is sending the DA's office, will review whether to pursue charges. I can't make you any promises about outcome, but the record is solid." She looked at me. "You handled this well, Mr. Vance." "I had time to prepare," I said. She nodded and walked to her patrol car. I went back inside. Dennis was still at his mailbox. I raised a hand. He raised his mail in return. It was enough. The living room was quiet. Evelyn was still in her chair. Julian was standing in the middle of the room, with his hands at his sides, looking at the floor. The green metal box still open on the coffee table in front of him. The bills still inside it, where he had placed them back into his mother's hands, and she had set the box down. Then his legs went. Not dramatically, just the way a person sits down when standing has become too much work. He went down to his knees on the living room floor in front of the chair where his mother was sitting, and he put his face in his hands. Evelyn leaned forward and put her hand on the back of his head. She did not say anything. She just held her hand there the way she had when he was small and sick, and there was nothing to do but let him know she was there. I stood in the doorway and watched them. Then I turned and walked to the bedroom. I knew what I was going to get. The Birkin bag was where I had put it. The afternoon, Vanessa dropped it on the sofa on the top shelf of our closet behind the box of winter sweaters inside the dust bag it came with when I bought it. I had moved it there 3 days after that afternoon without telling Evelyn. I did not want it somewhere she could see it and think about it every time she opened the closet door. I lifted it down. I carried it to the bathroom and set it on the counter and looked at it under the light. It was not damaged. Vanessa had handled it carelessly but briefly, and the leather had not marked. There was a faint smudge near the clasp that had not been there before. I got the soft cloth I keep in the medicine cabinet for cleaning my reading glasses and worked the smudge out in small circles until the leather was clean and even and the brass clasp caught the light the way it had the day I brought it home. Then I carried it to the living room. Julian was still on the floor. He had shifted from kneeling to sitting with his back against the front of the sofa, his legs stretched out, his head tipped back against the cushion. Evelyn was still in her chair. They had been talking quietly while I was in the bedroom. I could tell by the quality of the silence that replaced it when I came back into the room. The kind of silence that is comfortable rather than empty. I sat down on the arm of the sofa next to where Julian was sitting on the floor. I set the bag on the cushion beside me and picked up the soft cloth again, and went over the leather one more time slowly, the way I go over a finished repair at the shop, before I hand the keys back to the owner. Not because it needs it, because the doing of it means something. Evelyn watched me do it without speaking. When I was satisfied, I stood up and carried the bag to her chair and held it out. She looked at it in my hands for a moment, before she took it. She turned it over, once ran her thumb along the clasp, held it by the handles, the way she holds it when she is going somewhere she feels good about going. Then she set it on her lap and looked at me, and her eyes were bright in the way they get when she is moved, and is trying not to show it, and is not quite succeeding. I put my hand on her shoulder for a moment. That was all. I turned to Julian. He was looking up at me from the floor with the expression of a man who has been broken down far enough that there is nothing left to protect, and no energy remaining for pretense. 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, I said. You're coming to the shop with me. He blinked. The shop in Van Nuys. That's the one. Dad, I don't know anything about engines. I know. That's why you're coming. I looked at him steadily. A man pays his debts with his own hands. We start tomorrow. We work until the debt is gone or you learn something useful, whichever comes first. I paused. Either way, you come out ahead. Julian looked at the floor between his feet. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite grief. Something in between that does not have a clean name. He nodded once. The knock at the front door came 20 minutes later. Dennis Clark was on the porch with a large insulated carafe of coffee and a plate covered in aluminum foil that turned out to contain a warm batch of cinnamon rolls his wife had baked before she left for her sister's house that morning. He held both out and said simply, "Thought you guys could use some of this." I opened the door wider. "Come in, Dennis." He came in and sat at the kitchen table and did not ask a single question about what had happened or what the police car had been doing in front of the house or where the black Tahoe with Nevada plates had gone. He poured coffee into 4 mugs and talked about the sycamore tree on the corner of Vanawan that the city had been threatening to remove for 2 years and his strong feelings about the matter. Evelyn had equally strong feelings and expressed them. Julian ate 3 of the Korean pancakes without appearing to notice he was doing it. I drank my coffee and listened to my wife argue about a tree with our neighbor and watched my son eat without thinking about it for the first time in months, and I felt something in my chest that had been clenched since the afternoon Julian and Vanessa had pulled into the driveway begin very slowly to release. Dennis left at 1 o'clock. Julian went to lie down. Evelyn took the Birkin bag and set it gently on the small patio table near the back porch, where she could see it, while checking on the tomato plants in the October sun. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her smile as she looked at it completely at peace. Which it was. It had always been. That evening after dinner, I went to the garage. I opened the laptop. I pulled up the Nest footage archive one last time and watched both clips through from beginning to end. Then I closed the application. I moved both clips to the evidence folder I had shared with Marcus. I cleared the queue. I sat in the garage for a while with the laptop closed and the overhead light on, and the particular smell of motor oil and old cardboard that has been the smell of my thinking space for 28 years. Then I shut the light off and went inside. Julian was already at the kitchen table when I came downstairs at 5:40. He was wearing an old pair of jeans and a gray t-shirt and the work boots I had lent him from the garage. They were half a size too big, and he had doubled the socks to compensate. He had a mug of coffee in front of him, and he was looking at it the way people look at things they are using to anchor themselves while they think about something else. He did not hear me on the stairs. When I came around the corner, he looked up and straightened slightly the way he used to when he was 14 and had been caught doing something he was not supposed to be doing, though in this case he had not been doing anything except sitting with his own thoughts in the dark kitchen before the day started. "You're up," I said. "Couldn't sleep much," he said. I poured my coffee. We drove to the shop in my truck without talking, which was fine. Some mornings do not need filling up. Kowalski and Sons on Oxnard Street in Van Nuys had been in business since 1974. Pete Kowalski the younger had taken over from his father 12 years ago and had kept everything the same: the hand-painted sign above the bay doors, the smell of the place, the ancient radio on the workbench that picked up AM stations and nothing else. I had a key and the run of the shop on Monday mornings, which Pete had offered when I retired, and I had accepted because a man who has spent 31 years working with his hands does not stop needing to work with his hands just because he no longer has to. There was a 2019 Silverado in Bay 2 that needed the engine pulled for a rebuild. I showed Julian where the tools were. I showed him how to position the engine hoist and how to attach the load leveler to the lift points on the block. I demonstrated once, slowly. Then I stepped back. "Your turn," I said. He made mistakes. Not dangerous ones, the kind that come from inexperience rather than carelessness. He attached the hoist hook to the wrong point the first time and had to start over. He over-tightened a bolt and had to back it off. He moved too fast in the early stages and too slowly in the later ones when the engine was heavy and hanging and patience was what the job required. I corrected him when correction was necessary and said nothing when it was not. Around 9 o'clock, he straightened up from under the hood and pressed the back of his wrist to his forehead and looked at me across the engine bay. "Dad." "Yeah." "Were you ever scared?" When things got hard, I picked up a wrench and turned it over in my hands. The question did not surprise me. I had been waiting for some version of it since we left the house. "Every day," I said. "When your mother and I bought the house, I was 29 years old, and I had $600 in a savings account and a job that could have ended any week if the shop had a slow quarter. I was scared every day for about 3 years. Julian looked at his hands. They were marked with grease up to the wrists, which was new for him. "How did you handle it?" I set the wrench down. I showed up. Every morning I showed up and did the work in front of me and didn't spend energy on the things I couldn't do anything about that day. I looked at him across the engine. Fear doesn't go away because you ignore it. It goes away because you replace it with evidence that you can handle what's in front of you. The only way to get that evidence is to show up and handle it. Julian was quiet for a moment. "I stopped showing up," he said. "Not to the job, to everything else. I stopped showing up to the hard conversations. I stopped showing up to the truth." He turned his wrist over and looked at the grease on it. "I let her lead because leading was hard and following was easier." "I know," I said. "You knew. I watched you do it for 3 years. I said it without cruelty, because it was not a cruel observation. It was a true one. I kept waiting for you to stop. I should have said something sooner." He shook his head. "Wouldn't have helped. I had to get here myself." He looked up at me. "Is that why you didn't step in earlier when all of this was happening?" "Partly." I leaned against the workbench. "And partly because I needed to make sure I had everything in order before I moved. You do not confront a problem until you are prepared to see it through. That's as true in this shop as it is anywhere else." Julian almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest his face had gotten in a long time. Around noon, Pete came in to check on the Silverado. He looked at Julian, the borrowed boots, the grease, the general appearance of a man who had been doing unfamiliar physical work for 6 hours, and then looked at me with the brief, knowing expression of a man who understands certain things without being told them. "He any good?" Pete asked. "He'll learn," I said. Pete nodded, which was sufficient, and went back to his office. Marcus called at 2 in the afternoon, while Julian and I were eating sandwiches on the tailgate of my truck in the parking lot. I put him on speaker. "The footage has been formally submitted," Marcus said. "Farrell's office, the attorney Victoria had contacted, has been notified of the evidence and the pending review. I don't expect them to pursue anything further." A pause. "Julian's filing went through this morning. California no-fault standard processing. 60 days to finalize." Another pause. "Harrison, you should know you handled this about as well as it can be handled." I thanked him and hung up. Julian sat on the tailgate with his sandwich and looked at the middle distance for a moment. 60 days, he said. "Yes." He took a bite of his sandwich. He chewed. He swallowed. "Okay," he said. We drove home in the early evening. The valley was gold and flat and enormous in every direction, the way it gets in late afternoon when the light comes down at an angle and turns everything the color of something worth keeping. At the kitchen table, Evelyn had left a note in her handwriting: soup on the stove. Heat low. Don't let Julian skip dinner. Julian read the note. He stood at the stove and heated the soup and did not skip dinner. I came in from the garage later and found a letter on the kitchen counter. White envelope, neat handwriting. Return address, Henderson, Nevada. The name in the upper left corner was Vanessa Caldwell. 2 weeks passed. The way weeks pass after something large has moved through your life, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular weight of time that knows it is being measured. Julian stayed. He slept in his old room, which smelled like the cedar chest Evelyn keeps at the foot of the bed in there, and the particular stillness of a room that has been waiting. He went to the shop with me on Monday and Wednesday and Friday. He was getting better with the tools, not skilled yet, but developing the patience that skill requires, which is the harder thing to learn and the more important one. He did not talk about Vanessa unless I asked, and I did not ask often. There would be time for that. There was no urgency in the processing of it, only in the living through it. The envelope from Henderson had sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before I opened it. I had looked at it each morning over coffee and each evening after dinner, and had not been ready until I was ready, which is the only reliable schedule for certain things. I opened it on a Thursday morning when the house was quiet, and Evelyn was in the garden. The letter was handwritten on 2 pages of plain white paper, the handwriting neat and slightly cramped. The letters pressed firmly into the page, the way they are when someone is writing something they have rewritten several times in their head before committing it to paper. She did not begin with an apology. She began with a statement. I want you to know that what happened was not Julian's plan. He knew we were in financial trouble. He did not know how far I was willing to go. I want that on record, even if the only record is this letter. She went on. She acknowledged Victoria's role not to excuse her own, but to be accurate about the sequence of things. She acknowledged Nevada. She acknowledged that what she had done to her own mother, using her as an unwitting piece of a plan Victoria had never agreed to, was the thing she was least able to sit with. She did not use the word sorry. She used the words I was wrong 3 times in 3 different contexts, and the repetition had the quality of someone who has learned the difference between apologizing and accounting. The last paragraph was short. I'm not asking for anything. I don't think I have the standing to ask for anything. I just thought you deserved to know that the woman who wrote those notes in August is someone I'm trying to stop being. Not for you. For me. Because she scared me. I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I set it on the counter and stood there for a moment with my hands flat on the surface. Then I went to find Evelyn. She was at the far end of the garden in her green coat, the one with the frayed left cuff crouching down next to the row of tomato plants she had been nursing since April. The January morning was cool and flat and bright in the particular way of Southern California winters, not cold enough to require anything more than a coat, bright enough to make the garden look like it was lit from inside. She was talking to the plants, the way she always does, asking after them, telling them February was coming and things would warm up soon. The Birkin bag was on her arm. The Birkin bag sat nearby on the garden bench. She kept it in the open air now, without ceremony, without occasion, no longer hidden away in a dark closet simply because it belonged to her life. That was the correct way to wear something. I had thought so when I bought it, and I thought so now. I came to stand beside her. She looked up and then went back to the plants. Letter, she said. From Vanessa. She moved along the row, her hands working through the lower leaves, with the practiced knowledge of someone who has grown things in the same soil for 20 years. What did it say? That it wasn't Julian's plan. That she's trying to be different. I paused. That she was wrong. Evelyn considered this in the way she considers things fully without rushing, giving the information the time it requires. Do you believe her? I thought about the letter. The handwriting pressed hard into the page. The three uses of I was wrong. The last paragraph that did not ask for anything. I believe she means it right now, I said. Whether she manages it is something else. Evelyn nodded, which meant she thought that was the correct answer. We stood in the garden for a while without talking. The mockingbird that had been in the orange tree since August started up somewhere above us, its morning routine reliable and indifferent to everything below it. Down the block a lawnmower started, the ordinary sounds of a January morning in Reseda going about its business. My phone rang. Julian, I answered. Hey, Dad. His voice was easy in a way I had not heard from him in a long time. Not forced, easy, not performed ease, the genuine article. I'll be home by 7. Should I bring anything? I looked at Evelyn in her green coat with the frayed cuff, the Birkin bag resting safely on the bench beside her, her hands in the dirt of our garden, asking the plants how they were getting on. Just yourself, I said. That's enough. I put the phone in my pocket. There is a thing I learned in 31 years of fixing engines that applies, I have found, to most other things as well. When something is broken badly enough, you do not try to repair it around the broken part. You remove the broken part completely, and you rebuild from what remains. What remains is never nothing. There is always something solid underneath the damage, some component that held some structure that did not give. You find it. You build from there. I had spent 28 years building something in this house. A marriage, a family. The kind of life that does not announce itself because it does not need to. It simply exists day after day, cup of coffee after cup of coffee, repair after repair, season after season, in a garden that has never once failed to come back. Someone had tried to take it. They had come with boxes and documents and a plan that had been building since August, and they had walked into every room of my home and calculated its value and decided that what my wife and I had built across 3 decades was a resource to be extracted rather than a life to be respected. They had been wrong about what kind of man they were dealing with. I am a mechanic. I find the problem. I fix it. I hand back the keys. Evelyn straightened up beside me and brushed the soil from her hands. She looked at the garden, the bare winter rose, the orange tree holding its fruit, the ground that has absorbed 28 years of our effort and attention, and would absorb 28 more if we were given them. It's going to be a good spring, she said. Yes, I said. It is. I spent 60 years learning that a man's real wealth is not in his bank account. It is in what he refuses to surrender when the pressure comes. God gave me steady hands for engines for my wife's, for the quiet work of holding what matters when someone tries to take it. Here is what I want to say plainly. If the people around you treat your life like a resource to be extracted, that is not family. That is a transaction wearing family clothing. Say something sooner than I did. Document everything. Know your rights. Never sign anything in your own home under pressure. These are the dad's revenge stories nobody warns you about, not dramatic, but documented, prepared, and legally sound. The kind where family justice is earned quietly, defended carefully. I am not a perfect man, but I showed up. Every single day I showed up. If my story reached something in, you drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if stories of family justice and real dad's revenge stories matter to you, subscribe. Every week, one more story. Every week, the truth. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Stories on this channel contain fictional elements built for educational purposes. If this content is not for you, we completely respect that. Please feel free to find what suits you better.